Donald Trump didn't just threaten Canada and Greenland. He crossed a line that many leaders still believed would never be crossed out loud. And Canada understood immediately what this really was. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't bluster. It was a test of how far intimidation could be pushed in a world that had grown dangerously comfortable, believing that restraint would always return at the last second. Canada did not wait to find out where that line actually was. It moved. Greenland is not symbolic territory. It is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. It is protected by NATO, and it sits at the very center of Arctic security, shipping lanes, energy access, and future military positioning, all of which are directly tied to Canada's own survival and strategic future. When Donald Trump openly spoke about Greenland as something that could be taken, bought, or coerced, he was not speaking casually. He was sending a far more dangerous signal, that sovereignty itself could be treated as negotiable if enough pressure were applied. For Canada, that was the alarm bell, because if Greenland, protected by NATO, backed by Europe, anchored in international law, could be spoken about this way, then Canada's own sovereignty could just as easily be framed as conditional. The logic was impossible to ignore. If Greenland today, then who tomorrow?
The point was to send a message to Canada and to the rest of the world that what the United States is and has become is a gangster klepto state that will do what they want to do and shake down whoever they want to shake down. Gangster fascism. What he said at this press conference he gave was that American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. This was sending a message. And it's a clear message to Canada. He said, "We will secure our borders. We will stop the terrorists. We will defend our citizens against all threats, foreign and domestic. This operation should serve as a warning to anyone who would threaten American sovereignty." Well, clearly, Venezuela wasn't threatening American sovereignty. Venezuela was doing its own thing.
Canada did not react with outrage. It reacted with positioning. Prime Minister Mark Carney understood that loud condemnation would change nothing. What mattered was who stood where and how quickly the lines were drawn. Standing alongside Denmark, Canada made its position unambiguous. Borders are not bargaining chips, territorial integrity is not rhetorical, and the Arctic is not open to intimidation. This was not symbolic solidarity. It was a declaration of alignment, legally, politically, and strategically. Carney also understood something else that Donald Trump consistently underestimates. No country confronts coercion alone and wins. That is why Europe came first. Long before the Greenland threat became public, Carney had been laying groundwork across European capitals, rebuilding trust, reinforcing shared norms, and restoring Canada's reputation as a serious, stabilizing actor. That groundwork paid off when Trump's rhetoric escalated from Ukraine to Venezuela to Greenland, and even to talk of Canada as a 51st state. Europe did not stay silent. In a moment that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier, Emmanuel Macron openly warned that Trump's threats against Canada and its sovereignty would be deeply damaging to the global order itself. That mattered because it meant Canada was no longer standing alone. Thanks to Carney's alliance building, it was no longer just Canadians rejecting Trump's rhetoric. It was Europe's most powerful leaders saying that this kind of behavior endangers the entire international system. That is the difference between isolation and deterrence. And that difference did not happen by accident.
When U.S. President Donald Trump first threatened Canadian sovereignty, few, if any, of Canada's allies came to its defense publicly. But this week, French President Emmanuel Macron brought it up as an example of the U.S. turning away from its allies and breaking international norms.
Si le Canada sera soumis à la menace de devenir le 51e État ou autre.
Every day, people wonder if Canada will be threatened with becoming the 51st state, if Greenland will be invaded. Macron was speaking to a gathering of ambassadors in Paris.
C'est le désordre le plus grand, la loi du plus fort.
We are living in a time of utter chaos. It's the law of the strongest that prevails. His comments come days after the U.S. launched a military operation in Venezuela, and as the Trump administration ramps up its pledge to take over Greenland.
We're not in Kansas anymore.
Canada's former ambassador to the United Nations says it's all in line with the U.S.'s new national security strategy.
The hemisphere belongs to them and nobody else. They will use force if required. This is a deadly, serious challenge, not just for Canada, but for every country.
In an interview this week with the New York Times, Trump brushed aside questions about international law, saying his power is constrained only by his own morality.
Greenland did not exist in a vacuum. Before Greenland, there was Ukraine. Each time Donald Trump flirted with undermining Ukraine's sovereignty through pressure, conditional support, or transactional diplomacy, Canada deliberately and visibly positioned itself on the opposite side. Not with speeches, but with recognition, legitimacy, and presence. Canada treated Ukraine's leadership as sovereign, equal, and non-negotiable. That pattern mattered because when Greenland came into Trump's sights, the response was already rehearsed. Threats were answered with alignment. Coercion was answered with legitimacy. Silence was replaced with visibility. This was not coincidence. It was strategy. Canada made clear that it stands with those facing pressure, and the world took notice. Trump understands pressure. He understands how to exploit hesitation, how to isolate opponents, and how to make them feel alone. What he does not handle well is early, coordinated resistance that strips away his leverage before he can escalate. Canada did not wait for a crisis to peak. It built a perimeter around itself, Europe, NATO partners, Arctic stakeholders, and now even China. Every layer made Trump's next move more expensive, not emotionally, but politically and diplomatically. And the Greenland threat was never really just about Greenland. It was about the Arctic. Melting ice is opening shipping routes that will shape future trade. Vast energy reserves are becoming accessible. Military positioning in the high north is becoming decisive. Canada sits at the center of that future. By defending Greenland's sovereignty, Canada was defending a principle that directly protects its own Arctic interests. The message was subtle but firm. The Arctic is governed by rules, alliances, and law, not by whoever shouts the loudest. And that signal was heard far beyond Denmark.
You know, the coded language of weapons of mass destruction, giving a U.S. regime the ability to go in and invade in another country. And Prime Minister Trudeau tried and tried again to reassure the Americans, to use facts, to show that our border was not flooding the Americans with fentanyl, but it didn't matter. It was about establishing a narrative. Kash Patel of the FBI then ramped it up. He started to talk about needing to protect the American border from the Canadian terrorist threat. He talked about hundreds of terrorists coming across the border. It was ridiculous. We know that. But did you hear the New York Times and the Washington Post and the CNN and the blah blahs on the evening talk show saying, what the heck is he talking about, this threat from Canada? Donald Trump was establishing a narrative of threat. And then that threat was elevated again by Kristi Noem, who started to talk about the threat of the northern border, that's us, bringing criminal gangs, El Salvadorian gangs across the border to terrorize poor American citizens. We knew that was ridiculous. But again, the narrative of threat, and now Donald Trump is telling the world that he can go wherever he wants.
Canada never issued a threat to Donald Trump. It didn't need to. Instead, it demonstrated something Trump understands instinctively. Every time you escalate, you make your opponents more united. Every time you threaten, you strengthen the coalition against you. That is not leverage. That is self-defeat. The Greenland episode proved that intimidation no longer isolates Canada. It mobilizes the world around it. For decades, Canada's instinct had been to de-escalate quietly, smooth things over, avoid confrontation, and assume good faith would eventually prevail. Trump changed that calculus. From trade wars to annexation rhetoric, ambiguity stopped being safe. Mark Carney adjusted accordingly, not with bluster or theatrics, but with alliances that speak for themselves. The Greenland threat was not Trump's move. It was his miscalculation, because it forced Canada and its partners to stop assuming restraint would be rewarded. Canada did not escalate the confrontation. It closed Trump's options. By the time Trump understood the implications, Canada was no longer reacting to events. It was shaping them. And in geopolitics, that is what checkmate looks like. Before you go, if you value deep, no-nonsense analysis of global politics and Canada's role on the world stage, make sure you subscribe to Canada Today. This channel exists to cut through the noise and explain what actually matters, clearly, calmly, and without spin. And proper credit is due. Parts of today's analysis were inspired by detailed work from Ben Miles at Must Touch and Charlie Angus at Must Canada, whose reporting digs into geopolitical angles many outlets overlook. Their video is linked in the description and is well worth your time if you want to explore this topic further. Subscribe, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.